So the bell ringer, of course, what is imperialism? Because we'll continue talking about European domination in this unit. Hopefully, you had time to look at the chapter 16 and chapter 17 readings so you can add a little summary of each of those page selections. But for today in the notes, we'll go ahead and cover education, religion, and natural science. And of course, from this time period, we would start to see a little bit of divergence more so than in the time of Galileo, especially in natural sciences, with things, for instance, like Charles Darwin's theories on evolution. But we'd also see advancements in education. Northwestern European countries would reach 85% literacy rates, and you would find people on all ends of the political spectrum calling for primary education. And that included for both boys and girls over time. And because of these increased literacy rates, you should also see increase in the number of published materials as well. And libraries became more and more popular. But that didn't necessarily mean it was all quality. In the need to push for a greater quantity, obviously you had a lot of less sophisticated type of reading material being published. But it did lead to the popularization of knowledge and ideas and hopes for the future. People would even speculate excitedly about what the future might bring, especially when it comes to science. For instance, the thoughts of going to the moon first started to develop in the late 19th century. And with all this education, of course, people started to change about how they thought. Auguste Comte, which is spelled August with an E on the end, and Comte is Comte, developed the theory of positivism, believing that human development could occur through the study of science. And later on, of course, sociology would be based off some of Comte's teachings. And he divided human thought into three categories: theological, which of course is an explanation of the world around us through the divine or religious; metaphysical, abstract explanation of nature; and positive, which is explanation of nature in more detail and greater understanding. And then there was the idea of evolution. And there'd actually be more people involved with evolution and not necessarily just the kind involving what we think of when it comes to Darwin. Jean Baptiste Lamarck, which is spelled Lamarck, was the first thinker to come up with a theory that evolution occurred. But it was Darwin that would eventually write on the origin of species, talking about the principle of natural selection over time, that stronger species that had the ability to overcome and adapt would end up evolving, and this led to constant changes in species over time. Of course, that would be over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And he was the only one to come up with the idea of natural selection. Alfred Russel Wallace would also help with that idea. Some felt that undermined the argument that God created the universe, though, because it was the belief that everything was created as is and didn't change over time. Later on, Darwin goes even further, angering religious people, because he writes Descent of Man, arguing that human beings evolved as well. Unbeknownst to Darwin, though, some of his theories will also be used to study people in greater detail. Herbert Spencer came up with the idea of social Darwinism, which showed that stronger, more capable human beings would be successful, lesser, weaker human beings would fall behind. Not everyone bought into this, though. Thomas Henry Huxley believed that Darwin was correct, that there was evolution that occurred in nature, but he did not necessarily believe the same ideas could be applied to people. But nevertheless, social Darwinism kind of stuck, and it helped foster imperialism. Many Europeans, especially in Britain and France, believed that they were the superior beings, they were more evolved, and that they could perhaps teach or save people that were supposedly inferior. And you started to see these kind of ideas even in advertising. For instance, soap being advertised, as it's up on the screen there, it's basically saying that you could wash away some of the darker areas of the world. Well, that was kind of a play on words. They're trying to make the case that they could make Africa and India whiter if they could civilize people that were there, supposedly. But back in Europe, of course, there was a problem of the seeming contradiction between science and religion. People started to call into question the history of the Bible, especially since a monk quite some time ago had gone through and calculated the age of the earth only to be several thousand years old. But by this time, many scientists thought it was millions at least, and pointed out that the Bible doesn't necessarily have historical evidence to back up all parts of it. So Darwin and other scientists started to doubt and speculate that the earth was actually much older. And then there were philosophers that also questioned the morality of the Bible in particular. One of them was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is spelled Nietszshe. He thought that Christianity glorified weakness. It encouraged people to be patient and wait and not challenge anything, not rise to the occasion. And so he and others pushed a move toward more secularism, pushing religion out of the public sphere. And to some extent, churches had some resistance, especially in public education. They wanted to continue to control schooling, as we learned in the last unit. That, of course, came to an end in Germany. And they also moved toward making public schooling preferable to religious schooling in Great Britain with the Education Act of 1902. The same thing would also happen in France. But still, there would be an encouragement amongst the general public toward church and church revivals, especially in Britain and Ireland and France. And many looked for hope and symbolism in the church, even as things like education increased. Speaking of the church with a capital C, the Catholic Church, of course, had made it past the point of Italian unification without being conquered by military force. Pope Pius the ninth would be an I and an X, had railed against things like science and philosophy and politics, hoping to keep people's eyes on the church instead. And he reissued the idea that the Pope was incapable of making errors, known as papal infallibility. But his successor, Leo XIII, was more moderate, and even though he defended religious education and religious control of marriage, he also believed that there was corruption in society in the form of businesses and profiteering. But then, what often happens with the church, if you have a more moderate person, the next pope is going to be more conservative. And that's what happened with Pope Pius X, which is with an X. He required all the priests reject any type of modernism. And this time, you also started to see some anti Islamic thought develop in Europe. There already obviously was some before, but it started to expand considerably. Many believed that Islam, of course, was incompatible with Christianity, but also those in the science community speculated that Islam was incapable of developing scientific ideas. This is, of course, ridiculous because in the 13, 14, and 1500s, there's actually Muslims who helped develop greater sense of algebra, for instance, and engineering and architecture. But nonetheless, these types of stereotypes continue to develop. Some Christian missionaries did become more sympathetic to Muslims, but on the whole, anti-Islamic thought continued to grow. And there was a movement inside Islam, Salafi, which is spelled Salafi, that wanted to modernize Islam without making it like Western Europe. And the last thing I want to mention in the notes today would be development in physics. And for a long time, scientists thought that we could just portray abstract ideas about the physical nature of reality. But eventually, some other discoveries came along, particularly X-rays and radiation. Max Planck, which is spelled Planck, started to develop greater theories of energy, while Albert Einstein developed the theory of relativity. Time and space are intertwined. And then Werner Heisenberg developed the uncertainty principle, speculating about the nature of subatomic particles. And then, of course, when it comes to radiation, Marie and Pierre Curie helped discover radioactivity and radioactive materials. This would, of course, along with those previous physicists I just mentioned, eventually lead to the development of nuclear energy, although that would be decades away at this point. Unfortunately for Marie Curie and Pierre Curie, they didn't discover radiation and its harmful effects until they experimented quite a bit with it. In fact, Marie Curie was known for taking radioactive materials and just putting in her apron pockets and carrying them around from place to place before they realized, of course, the dangers. And so they both ended up eventually dying of radiation poisoning. Well, that's all we'll cover for today. Tomorrow we'll talk about literature, art, social science, and politics. And then the next 2 days we'll talk about imperialism. So use the rest of the time to finish up your notes there. And also make sure that you have looked at your pages in chapter 16 and 17.